Summer 1944. Behind the lines of a world at war, trains rolled across the American heartland carrying thousands of prisoners, some barely out of girlhood. They were German women, nurses, auxiliaries, farm daughters swept into a war many of them barely understood. They expected cruelty. They expected hatred. They expected to be treated as enemies. But when the gates of the American POW camps opened, something unexpected drifted toward them on the morning air. The warm smell of bacon. They froze, because in their minds, the enemy was brutal. The enemy was merciless. The enemy would not feed you like a guest. That moment simple, ordinary, almost absurd, would challenge everything they thought they knew about war, loyalty, and humanity. And for some, it would change their lives forever. Asterisk, asterisk, the train rattled through fields that seemed to stretch forever, a horizon so wide it swallowed the sky. Inside the railcars, the women sat shoulder to shoulder, uniforms faded, boots muddy with the soil of a homeland now distant and burning. Their hands were still shaking from the front, the artillery blasts, the collapsing cities, the screams in the night. They had grown used to smoke instead of sunrise, hunger instead of meals, fear instead of rest. Some were nurses who had treated boys who would never go home. Some were auxiliaries who had worked in cold offices writing the names of the dead. Some had simply been in the wrong place when the Allies advanced. The rumors had followed them the entire journey. America was said to be merciless to its prisoners. They were told they would be starved, beaten, made to work until they collapsed. Some whispered of executions. Others of camps where people disappeared. Even those who didn't believe the stories still clung to silence, because silence had been their shield throughout the war. They had watched neighbors disappear simply for saying the wrong thing. They knew that survival meant caution. Even now, across an ocean, their bodies held the memory of fear. When the train finally slowed, the wheels screeching, no one moved. The doors opened and sunlight poured in, blinding, golden, warm. American soldiers stood waiting, rifles slung casually, without the hostility the women expected. There were no shouts, no blows, just a gesture to step down one by one. The air smelled different here, cleaner, sharper, and then something else, something familiar from a childhood before the war had swallowed everything. A smell that felt impossible, almost cruel in its gentleness. Bacon, cooking nearby. One of the women, a nurse named Annalise, stopped mid-step. She hadn't smelled bacon in years, not since rationing had tightened, not since Germany's cities had been reduced to rubble and hunger became a quiet and constant ache. The scent was almost enough to make her cry. Not from hunger, though hunger was there, but from memory. Of mornings before the war, before blackouts, before the constant dread that someone you loved would not return home. For a second, the war fell away, replaced by a kitchen window, her mother humming softly, sunlight catching dust in the air like tiny stars. But the moment was fragile, quickly overshadowed by suspicion. Why would the Americans feed them something so precious? Was it a trick? An insult? A reminder that the enemy had plenty while their family starved back home? The confusion tangled with exhaustion, creating a silence that hung heavy as the women were guided through the gates. Inside, the camp did not resemble the brutal prisons they had imagined. There were barracks, simple, wooden, lined neatly in rows. A mess hall. A medical facility. Gardens. The guards looked tired, not cruel. Some barely older than the women themselves. The ground was clean. There were no watchtowers with machine guns pointed down. Instead, there was order, discipline, but also, strangely, dignity. That first breakfast was almost too much to process. The women sat at long tables, unsure, stiff, trying to read the room. The American cooks did not stare or mock them. They served them like any other group of people. Plates of eggs, bread still warm, and bacon crisp at the edges, the fat glistening. The smell was overwhelming. Hunger made it dizzying. But something deeper made it almost painful, because war had taught them that the enemy was less than human, that the enemy wanted to destroy them. Yet here they were, being fed better than many civilians in Germany at that very moment. The world they thought they knew cracked, just a little, right there in that mess hall. Anneliese's hands trembled as she lifted her fork. She had seen men die with her name on their lips, begging her to save them. She had seen triumph turn to ash. She had believed, with all the desperation of someone raised inside a collapsing nation, that the enemy was monstrous. But when she tasted that first piece of food, something inside her shifted. Not gratitude, not relief, something quieter, something dangerous. It was a single thought that challenged the entire machinery of hate. She had been taught, if the enemy is human, then what have we all been doing? Around her, other women ate slowly, exchanging glances not of fear now, but of disbelief. No one spoke, but the silence no longer felt like oppression. It felt like awakening. Outside, the American flag moved in the wind. A guard leaned on his post, eyes half-lidded from fatigue, maybe thinking of home. The war was still raging across the ocean. The world was still burning. But in that small, ordinary moment, something remarkable happened. A group of young women torn from everything they knew, shaped by propaganda, hardened by conflict, began to understand that the world was not as simple as they had been told, and that realization would change everything that followed. The war had taken their homes, their certainty, their innocence. But in this strange land, surrounded by the enemy, they were about to learn what it meant to rebuild their humanity piece by fragile piece. The shock of kindness did not erase the war. It only brought it closer, sharper, more painful to touch. For the women, the camp became a place where battles continued unseen, fought not with rifles or orders, but inside the mind. Some clung tightly to the ideology they had carried from home, the one drilled into them through youth leagues, posters, speeches, and songs. To admit doubt felt like betrayal. To question the certainty of enemy and homeland was to risk losing the only foundation they had left. And yet, every day in the camp provided more contradictions, more cracks in the walls built around their thoughts. Anneliese felt it most when night fell. When the cafeteria was dark, when conversations died down to whispers, and when the hum of cicadas outside the barracks sounded almost like static on a broken radio. She would lie awake on her cot, staring at the wooden ceiling, hearing faint laughter from the American guards playing cards in the distance. Not taunting laughter, not cruel laughter, just ordinary, familiar, human. And it was that normalcy that unsettled her more than any weapon or threat ever had. Because if the enemy could laugh like that, if they could speak softly, if they could treat prisoners with decency, then what did that say about everything she had believed? Yet not everyone saw it the same way. Among the German prisoners, there were women who still held fiercely to the ideology they had carried from home. Women who believed that loyalty was the only virtue left in a collapsing world. They warned others not to be deceived. They spoke in low, cutting tones that carried the bite of conviction. This is a performance. Do not become weak. Do not forget who you are. And their words had power. Because when you have lost your country, your city, your family, your certainty identity becomes a fragile flame you protect with your entire being. These ideological leaders were not always cruel. Often, they were simply afraid. Afraid of losing meaning. Afraid of waking up to a world where everything they sacrificed for was for nothing. Afraid that the dead had died for lies. They believed fiercely because belief was the only thing left holding their past together. For them, the smell of bacon was not kindness, it was a threat. A crack in the dam holding back grief. The tension grew slowly, quietly, like a rope being pulled from both ends. The Americans did not understand the quiet war unfolding in the women's minds. They simply maintained the camp. They supervised work rotations, provided medical care, and escorted groups to do chores in nearby towns. And that was where the real breaking point came, not inside the camp, but outside of it. One cool autumn morning, several women, including Annalise, were assigned to farm labor at a small family homestead just beyond the camp boundary. The farm was modest white farmhouse, sloped barn roof, rows of corn, chickens scratching at dust. The kind of place Annalise had seen in childhood picture books before war rewrote her world into rubble and sirens. The family who owned the farm watched the women with guarded curiosity, but not fear. The mother of the house, a woman with tired eyes and dirt-streaked hands, gave instructions in slow, careful English. The work was simple: harvesting, sorting produce, stacking baskets. At midday, the farmer's mother set out water and bread for everyone, including the prisoners. Not luxurious, not dramatic. Just food shared among people who were working. But the simple act of being handed a cup of cold water by someone who saw you not as a threat, but as a tired human being, it struck harder than any speech. Annalise remembered how in Germany, years into total war, kindness had become a luxury no one could afford. Everyone was hungry, exhausted, afraid of judgment, of informants, of the government's eyes everywhere. Here, in a foreign land she had been taught to fear, she found a kind of normal life she had almost forgotten existed, and it broke her, not visibly, not with tears, but with realization. She had given nearly everything: her youth, her energy, her hope, to a world that rewarded loyalty with loss. And now, standing in a silent field under a wide American sky, with soil on her hands and bread in her grip, she felt something she had not felt in years. She felt free. It terrified her, because freedom meant choice. Choice meant responsibility. And responsibility meant facing the truth, that she had served a war machine built on cruelty and destruction. That the world she defended was collapsing not from enemy strength, but from the rot inside its own foundation. When she returned to the camp that evening, the ideological leaders noticed the silence in her eyes. They noticed the distance. They saw the shift. And like frightened animals sensing threat, they responded with pressure. You must stay strong. You must stay loyal. You must not forget the fatherland. Their voices were sharp, urgent, brittle, because they too feared that if even one woman began to change, the entire fragile identity holding them together would crumble. The bacon had not been the lesson. It had been the first signal, the first opening of a door. The real transformation was happening now, in the quiet between work shifts, in shared bread, in the absence of hatred where hatred was expected. And deep inside, Annalise and others like her began to understand that survival was no longer just about living through the war. It was about learning how to live after it, and that would be the hardest battle of all. Winter arrived slowly, creeping across the camp in pale mornings and hard frosts. The wooden barracks grew cold at night, and the women slept close beneath thin blankets. Their conversations were quieter now, filled less with certainty and more with questions no one had the courage to say aloud. The transformation was not dramatic. It was a slow erosion of the world they once believed was unshakable, but in every group, there are those who cannot allow doubt to exist. Her name was Helga, before the surrender. She had been part of the League of German Girls, trained to believe that obedience was virtue, that the fatherland was sacred, that sacrifice was honor. She had watched cities burn and had not wept. She had written letters for dying soldiers without letting her hands tremble. To her, strength meant refusing to break. And now, surrounded by women who were beginning to soften, to question, to see the Americans not as monsters, but as people, she felt something like betrayal rising around her like smoke. Helga's voice became sharper as the days passed. She patrolled the barracks with a kind of vigilante certainty, reminding the others of the oath they had taken, of the mothers and brothers and lovers who had died for the cause. If we forget who we are, she warned, then all that suffering will have been for nothing. But even Helga felt the strain. Even she flinched when she saw the American guards laughing with each other, sharing cigarettes, scratching notes in notebooks to send home. The enemy looked too human. And that truth was a silent threat more dangerous than any weapon. The Americans, watching but not understanding, soon noticed the tension. They didn't know the history. They didn't know about loyalty committees or ideological pressure or the fear of being branded a traitor. They saw only quiet arguments, whispers in corners, sudden silences when guards approached. But the women knew exactly what was happening. There was a war unfolding inside them, identity cracking, loyalty bending. Fear clashing with awakening. The breaking point came not from violence, but from news. One afternoon, a soldier arrived with a sack of Red Cross letters, small, folded papers carrying fragments of distant lives. For some women, the letters were empty. Cities destroyed. Families untraceable. Homes gone. But for a few, like Annalise, the news came in a tone so quiet it felt unreal. Her hometown was gone. Bombed into dust. Her mother unaccounted for. The hospital she worked in, where she had once scrubbed floors, stitched wounds, held hands as life slipped away, was rubble now. She sat in the cold of the barracks, the letter limp in her hand, feeling the world fall inward. The others watched without words. Loss was something they all understood. And yet there was something else in the letter. A single line, almost an afterthought. Some Americans have been helping distribute food to the children. They say it is to prevent starvation. Annalise stared at those words. They burned. Not because they hurt, but because they didn't fit the story she had built her life around. The enemy was not supposed to care about her people. The enemy was supposed to destroy, not rebuild. The enemy was never supposed to see the starving children and think, we cannot let them die. The room felt smaller. The air unsteady. The world, once black and white, blurred into gray. That night, as the barracks lay dim and restless, Helga confronted her. She whispered, sharp as a knife, this is how they win. Not with guns. With doubt. With kindness meant to weaken us. Don't let them take what is yours. But Annalise did not respond. She simply looked at the ceiling again, the same way she had on those early nights. But now the silence was not fear. It was realization that she had been living in a world built from walls. Walls of slogans. Walls of pride. Walls of pain so deep it became normal. And for the first time, she wondered what would happen if she stopped holding those walls up. The next morning, the prisoners were led to work duty again. This time, it was repairing storm fences around the camp. The Americans worked beside them, not commanding, not distant, but laboring with the same cold hands and aching muscles. One soldier, barely older than they were, paused when he noticed Annelise's distant eyes. He didn't speak German. She didn't speak English. But he nodded, slow and gentle, as if to say, I see your pain. I cannot fix it, but I will not turn away from it. And something in her broke not down, but open. The other women watched it happen, even if they could not name it. In that moment, the enemy no longer existed. Only people did. People exhausted by war, sick of death, longing for peace, haunted by memories they could not escape. Helga saw it too. And something inside her recoiled, not in hatred, but in fear of losing the only certainty she had left. The cold wind carried the distant scent of breakfast again. Bacon, eggs, bread. The same smell that had shattered the first wall months ago. Only now, it was not a shock. It was a reminder. The world was bigger than the borders they had been taught to die for. Something new was beginning inside them. Not surrender. Not betrayal. Transformation. A slow, quiet awakening to a truth far more powerful than propaganda. Humanity cannot be destroyed, not even by war. ***. By early spring, The camp had changed in ways no one could fully explain. The guards noticed it in the silence that no longer felt tense. The cooks noticed it in the way the women no longer hesitated before sitting at the tables. Even the air seemed softer, as though the world itself was exhaling after years of holding its breath. War still raged across Europe, but here, tucked far from the front, the fight was no longer about land, flags, or leaders. It was about identity, about who these women would become after everything they had known had burned away. The Americans began offering language lessons, partly to ease communication, partly to keep the prisoners occupied. At first, only a few women attended. Learning the enemy's words felt dangerous, like stepping over a line that could not be uncrossed. But curiosity, once awakened, does not fade. Soon, more appeared, notebooks made from scraps of brown paper, pencils worn almost to the wood. They learned simple words: water, bread, thank you, morning. Words that were less about vocabulary and more about building a bridge across something that had once seemed endless. Annalise found herself drawn to the classes. Not because she wanted to be American, not because she wanted to belong, but because she needed to understand the world beyond the walls of the ideology that was collapsing inside her. She practiced the sounds carefully, shaping unfamiliar letters into meaning. The first time she spoke a full sentence to a guard, "Thank you for the food," she felt the ground shift under her. The guard smiled, surprised, and replied with slow, careful German, "You are welcome." It was a small exchange, the kind of moment that wouldn't appear in any history book. But in that instant, the borders drawn in their minds began to fade. They were no longer enemy and prisoner. They were two human beings who had lost too much to continue living behind walls. But not everyone welcomed this change. Helga watched the language class from a distance, her expression carving itself deeper each day into something hard, bitter, frightened. She held her convictions like a drowning person clutching a rope. To let go meant sinking. To let go meant admitting that everything she had believed, everything she had sacrificed for, might have been built on a lie. One evening, she confronted the group. The barracks had grown quiet, lanterns flickering low. Shadows held their breath. "Do you think they will ever see you as equal?" she demanded. Her voice did not tremble. It cut through the air like steel. "Do you think they forgive what we fought for? They feed you, yes. They smile, yes. But do not be deceived. You are a prisoner. They are the victors. They are only kind because they have already won." The room held stillness like a held knife. The women listened, not because Helga commanded authority, but because they understood her fear. They had felt it themselves. The fear of losing the last piece of a world that no longer existed. But now the fear no longer controlled them. It was Annalise who spoke first. Her voice quiet, steady, fragile but unbroken. "We are all prisoners," she said. "Not just here. In our minds. In what we were taught to believe. In what we are afraid to question." Helga stared at her, something desperate flickering behind her eyes. For the first time, she did not respond. She simply turned away, swallowed by the shadow of a world that had given her identity, but left her nothing to build a life from. Over the next weeks, work assignments took the women deeper into the surrounding community. Some worked in orchards, others in canning factories, others still in local hospitals where they assisted with washing linens and preparing bandages. The Americans remained cautious, but they also remained human. They spoke. They asked questions. They listened. One day, while helping in a small-town grocery, Annalise noticed a child watching, her eyes wide, curious, unafraid. The girl approached and held out a small apple, bruised but whole. No words, no judgment. Just a gift. A simple offering across a divide carved by war. Annalise felt tears rise, sudden and overwhelming. She accepted the apple with a tremor, whispering the English word she had worked so hard to learn. "Thanks." The child smiled and ran back to her mother. No fanfare. No profound acknowledgement. Just a moment of ordinary life. And for a woman whose world had been death, that normalcy felt like a miracle. The women who returned to camp that evening carried that moment with them, like a lantern against the dark. For the first time in years, they had seen themselves not as soldiers or prisoners or tools of a dying regime. They had seen themselves as human beings capable of giving and receiving kindness. It was a quiet revolution, no banners, no speeches, no battles. Just a slow, fragile rebuilding of the soul. But war has a long memory. And the world outside the fences was changing faster than any of them knew. Soon, news would come that would force them to face what they could not yet speak aloud. The war was ending, and when it did, they would have to choose who they were without uniforms, without orders, without ideology to hide behind. For the first time, their future was not something decided for them. It was something they would have to build. Asterisk. The spring of 1945 arrived with a silence that felt unnatural. No one heard the surrender when it happened. There were no trumpets, no guns laid ceremoniously down, no banners signaling peace. The news came in the form of a single sentence spoken by a guard, his voice low and careful, as though the words themselves were fragile. "Germany has capitulated." The camp froze. Time stopped. The women blinked, suspended between shock and emptiness. Because surrender did not mean relief. It did not mean joy. It meant that the world they had known, however broken, however brutal, was now gone. Some women wept openly, shoulders shaking, as years of tension broke all at once. Others stared forward without expression, the numbness of disbelief settling like frost along their bones. Because if the war was over, then everything they had endured, the hunger, the terror, the loyalty, the sacrifice, had nowhere left to go. No purpose. No resolution. Only memory. And memory was often the heaviest burden of all. Annalise stood in the yard, the grass damp beneath her boots, and felt a hollow ache spreading inside her. She did not grieve the regime. She did not grieve the ideology. She grieved the absence of identity. She had spent her youth following orders, stitching wounds, holding dying hands and whispering comfort into fading ears. It had given her purpose, direction, meaning. Now, the silence where orders once lived felt endless. The American commanders told the prisoners they would soon be processed for repatriation. The words sounded gentle, but the weight of it was enormous. Return to a country that no longer existed. Go back to cities reduced to skeletons of stone and ash. Rejoin families who may or may not be alive. And carry with them the knowledge that the enemy they had been taught to hate had shown them humanity their own government had denied. The camp changed again, work slowed, guards relaxed, routines loosened. Women walked the paths between barracks without the tension that had once wound through every gesture. But beneath the surface was something deeper, fear of what waited beyond the gates. For months, the camp had been a strange kind of refuge, a liminal space between who they had been and who they would become. Outside, reality waited like winter behind a closed door. Helga changed too. Not in the way the others had. She grew quieter, thinner, her certainty turning inward like a blade. She did not speak of loyalty anymore. She did not lecture. She simply watched. The fight she had waged inside herself was consuming her, not in fire, but in slow collapse. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the wire fence, she approached Annalise not as a leader, not as an opponent, but as a girl who had once believed the world made sense. "Do you think we can ever go home?" she asked. Annalise did not have an answer. Because home was not a place anymore. It was a memory. One you carried or rebuilt, if you had the strength. When the day of departure came, the women gathered at the gate with their few belongings. Some had letters tucked into their pockets. Others had small tokens given by Americans, a handkerchief, A piece of ribbon, a single English word written carefully on folded paper. The guards did not call them prisoners anymore. They simply called them by their names. As they boarded the trucks, the smell of breakfast drifted across the yard one last time: eggs, warm bread, bacon. The scent that had broken the first wall, that had begun the quiet revolution inside their hearts. Annalise paused. She closed her eyes. She let the smell wash over her, not as a symbol, not as a lesson, but as a reminder of something she had almost lost forever: the ability to feel human. The road ahead was uncertain. There would be suspicion, hunger, nights filled with memory. There would be neighbors who resented them, towns that no longer existed, landscapes marked by graves and silence. But there would also be new choices, new beginnings made not from obedience, but from understanding. The women left the camp changed, not by force, not by persuasion, but by the simplest truth of human existence: that kindness has the power to unmake hatred, and hatred, when confronted with humanity, cannot survive unchanged. As the trucks rolled away, the camp grew smaller behind them, but the lessons they carried would not fade. They would travel with them into ruined cities, into rebuilding streets, into the lives they would shape from the ashes of a world that had burned. No one would write their names in history books. No monuments would rise for them. Asterisk.